This week we're going to delve more into your persuasive argument. Now, next week what we're going to do is we're going to take the argument model that we developed this week and we're going to make it much more stylistically rich. So you may remember from last week, this speech, this persuasive speech, is more scripted. We've come to a point now in the class where we can start writing more for the ear, and we can start writing rich stylistic devices for the ear. And for this speech, you need to be thinking more in terms of high oratory. I think that's a good exercise as a way of expanding the type of writing and speaking you can do. Now, before we get to that stylistically rich writing, we have to get our argumentative ducks in a row. And that's really what this week is about. So we're going to start off by identifying and responding to counter-arguments. Now, not every one of you is going to need to do this in your speech for this class or speeches that you give outside of this class. Nevertheless, I do think it's useful to be aware of strategies for identifying and responding to counter-arguments. Then we're going to work on developing calls to action. Now, when we get to this, I'll certainly unpack this further, but basically a call to action is a recommendation that you're giving to your audience about next steps. Having talked through the issue, what can they do next? And that's what we're going to be spending some time on. Once we get those argumentative pieces down, we'll turn our attention to arrangement, thinking in terms of some arrangement patterns you might elect to use for this speech. We'll also spend a fair bit of time talking about congruency, making sure that the different parts of your speech work well together. And then finally, we'll end with argumentative fallacies. So by the end of this week, you should have some tools for making and arranging motivational arguments, persuasive and motivational arguments. By the end of this week, you should be able to identify fallacies in other speeches and avoid them in your own. Now, in a more specific sense, you should have, by the end of this week, a solid argument that identifies ills, blames, and cures, and provides the audience some recommendation, those calls to action. So with that, we're going to turn to this first issue of thinking through counter-arguments, specifically in terms of what does the audience need to hear?